Today I bring you a tale of magic and mystery, which may resonate with the legends told by your ancestors. Prepare to dive into a story of adventure and mysteries that will capture your attention until the last minute. Without further ado, let us delve into this fascinating story. It all begins in a medieval village in Europe. Here lives David, a young tailor known for his wit in a humble house. One day, a honey seller arrives in the village. David invites her in, assuring her that he would lighten her load by buying some of her honey. However, in the end, he only purchases 100 grams. The seller, disappointed by the small order after expecting a large purchase, criticizes David for his cunning and walks away murmuring about his slyness. After the woman's departure, David sets out to enjoy his bread with honey, but a group of flies lands on it. With a skilled movement of his handkerchief, he manages to kill 7 with a single blow. Proud of his feat, he feels the need to proclaim his victory, so he embroiders on a piece of cloth the inscription, "In a single blow, 7 fallen," omitting that he was referring to the flies. Then, reflecting on his life as a tailor, he decides it is time to seek greater fortunes. He then dresses in a warrior's attire, ready to venture beyond the known. With only the essentials, David embarks on his adventure. Far from there, we move to the majestic palace of King George. The monarch, advanced in years, increasingly relies on Klaus, his cunning minister, who aspires to the throne and plans to marry Pavla, the king's daughter. Despite Klaus's schemes to gain the approval of the king and Pavla, both resist his machinations. At a dinner meeting, Pavla offers apples to her father while Klaus, with clear intentions, tries to seduce her with flirtations. Pavla, indifferent, pays him no attention, leaving Klaus in an awkward position. Meanwhile, David, who had made significant progress on his journey, encounters a bird in a bush and decides it would make a good travel companion, stowing it in his bag. As he proceeds, David crosses paths with a giant who disdainfully tells him he has no time to talk to someone beneath him. To impress, David boasts of having defeated 7 in a single blow, without revealing that they were merely flies. The giant, wanting to demonstrate his superiority, squeezes a stone until water comes out. Ingeniously, David takes a piece of cheese from his bag and squeezes it, pretending to also extract water from a stone. The giant, believing David possesses comparable strength, lifts a huge rock and throws it far away, amazed by the young man's cunning. David, in an act of unmatched cunning, releases the bird from his backpack, suggesting that the stone thrown by the giant flew so high it hasn't returned yet. The giant, completely fooled, tries to impress further by lifting a heavy tree branch. David quickly clings to nearby foliage, and as the giant drags the branch, he plays with the leaves, subtly mocking the giant's simple brute strength. Baffled, but still eager to show his valor, the giant invites David to his lair that afternoon to meet his brothers and demonstrate his bravery. In the palace, under the cover of night, Princess Pavla shares a moment of confidence with Linda, the young cook. Whispering, Pavla reveals her desire to flee to avoid marriage to Klaj, a union she does not want but feels compelled to consider. Despite her longing for freedom, the princess is concerned about leaving her elderly father behind, especially now that her mother is gone, and feels the pressure of not being able to delay her wedding much longer. In a change of setting, David finds himself in an ancient ruin surrounded by the giant and his brothers gearing up for a showdown. The giants, amazed by David's feat of knocking down 7 rivals with a single blow, do not hide their admiration. During the night, one of the giants offers David his large bed to rest in. However, David, unaccustomed to such a luxury, prefers to curl up among some sacks. Later, the most suspicious giant, in an attempt to finish David, strikes the bed with a mallet, not realizing David is not there, mistakenly believing he has eliminated him. At dawn, in the royal court, Klaj continues to alarm the king about various dangers: giants to the south, unicorns to the north, and a boar that is destroying the crops. He argues that by marrying Pavla and becoming the heir, he could address these problems, thus alleviating the monarch's concerns. Although the king is tired of Klaj's manipulations, the lack of other trustworthy advisors makes him seriously consider his proposal. Meanwhile, Klaj and the king surprise Pavla and Linda chatting in the kitchen, and the king is uncomfortable seeing his daughter involved in culinary tasks. Shortly after, Klaj addresses Pavla authoritatively, demanding she leave the kitchen. The princess firmly tells him to respect her spaces. Then, Pavla seeks out her father to question the decision to marry her off to someone who does not respect her boundaries. The king, trapped by circumstances, sadly explains that the marriage is necessary for her to take on royal responsibilities, as he can no longer bear the burdens of government himself. He asks her to prepare for the official announcement of their engagement that same afternoon in the court. After the king's departure, Klaus approached Pavla with an arrogant and determined attitude. Grabbing her arm, he announced that he would be the next king and that she would be his queen, urging her to accept her fate as soon as possible. Pavla, offended by his audacity, confronted him firmly, rejecting his words with disdain and declaring that she would never marry someone like him. In a moment of anger, she smashed a plate and decisively left the scene. Simultaneously, David was waking up from his sleep only to discover that 3 ogres were rummaging through his belongings. Noticing his presence, the terrified ogres fled, believing he had died the previous night from an attack they had planned. However, David had avoided sleeping in his bed that night, leading them to think he was immortal. After gathering his things, David resumed his journey and eventually arrived near King George's castle. Exhausted, he decided to rest in a nearby cart, where he fell asleep. A passing boy soon noticed something peculiar on David's strap. Seeing the message on David's strap detailing his feats, the boy got scared and ran to inform his father. Upon reading the message, the father, concerned for everyone's safety, quickly summoned the king's soldiers. Impressed by the words on the strap, they brought David before the king to clarify the situation. Meanwhile, at court, everyone had gathered for the announcement of Pavla and Klaus's engagement. Pavla, clearly discontented and defiant, arrived barefoot and unadorned, manifesting her rejection of the engagement. The king, aware of her discomfort, tried to persuade Klaus to reconsider, but Klaus, steadfast in his decision, insisted on proceeding with the announcement, convinced that Pavla would eventually accept. At that critical moment, as the king was about to make the announcement, the soldiers interrupted, bringing David to the center of the court. Presenting David, the soldiers explained his alleged feat of defeating 7 enemies in a single strike. The king, impressed, expressed his admiration for such feats, declaring that a warrior of such caliber deserved to be honored and welcomed into his palace. David, seizing the opportunity, enthusiastically accepted the offer, seeing in it the adventure and recognition he had sought. Klaus, unsettled by the appearance of a bold and valiant competitor, confronted David about his martial skills. With reckless bravado, David proclaimed himself a warrior of great deeds. The monarch then received him as a guest of honor at his royal residence, providing both asylum and recognition, while ingeniously delaying the engagement he least desired for his daughter. Pavla, observing David, felt comforted and filled with hope, captivated by his demeanor and audacity. From the moment Pavla realized that marrying the young man was a real possibility if he proved his worth, she could not hide her enthusiasm. As the commitment was declared, the sovereign chose to postpone it, suggesting they would evaluate it in the future. During the event, Pavla and David shared smiles that betrayed a mutual attraction, though no one else knew that he was actually a modest tailor. Later on his way to his quarters, David encountered Pavla, who flirted with him unabashedly. Overwhelmed by the novelty of the situation and the charm of a princess, he felt nervous, unsure of how to react. Although he eventually retreated to his room, his heart was exultant for having made an impression on such a splendid lady. At dawn, beneath the princess's window, David began to recount his supposed military exploits with great emphasis, initially capturing Pavla's interest. However, as his tales of braggadocio intensified, and in the attentive hearing of 3 hidden soldiers, Pavla lost interest and closed the window, confiding to her friend Linda that David seemed to be just another braggart. Linda, in a conciliatory tone, suggested patience, reminding her that David was unfamiliar with those circles and was possibly just nervous. The soldiers, for their part, informed the king that David had claimed to have defeated 7 adversaries with a single blow, although there were actually only 3 who heard him. Klaus saw here an opportunity and tried to convince the king that David represented a potential threat, capable even of usurping the throne. However, the king dismissed such claims, doubting David had such capabilities. Undeterred, Klaus devised a plan to eliminate David. He proposed using the young man's strength in a mission for the kingdom, sending him south to face 2 giants that terrorized that region. Although the king was skeptical, remembering that many of his best warriors had fallen to those same giants, Klaus persuaded the monarch that this was a perfect opportunity to test David's supposed valor and, incidentally, free the kingdom from those fearsome enemies. In the end, the monarch consented and summoned David, offering him half of his kingdom and the hand of his daughter if he managed to defeat the giants. David, overflowing with joy, immediately accepted, although Klaus remained skeptical, fearing that David would never return from such an endeavor. Despite this, David took on the task, and the king arranged for 3 brave soldiers to accompany him. As they parted, Pavla waved goodbye to him, while Klaus muttered that his hopes were in vain. David, accompanied by the 3 soldiers, headed south. After a long march, the soldiers pointed out that they had reached the dreaded habitat of the giants. David asked them to wait, and he moved alone through the forest to a clearing where two giants were sleeping under a tree. With great accuracy, David picked up some stones from the ground, stored them in his backpack, and climbed a nearby tree. Hidden among the branches, he threw a stone at one of the giants, who woke up startled. Confused and furious, the giant accused the other of hitting him. The other, denying everything, convinced him it had been a mere mistake, and both fell back asleep. Without delay, David threw another stone at the second giant, who, irritated, reproached the first. After a brief exchange of words, both settled back down. David persisted with his strategy until he finally managed to make both giants, annoyed and convinced that the other was attacking them, stand up and begin to fight violently with their clubs. In a furious confrontation, each ended the other's life. After the fall of the giants, David climbed down from the tree and returned to the kingdom. At court, Klaus persuaded the king to organize a grand celebration to honor David, setting a precedent as no one had ever returned alive from that region before. It was agreed that David would receive half the kingdom and the hand of a princess as a reward. With a glorious entrance, David and the soldiers arrived at the court. The king, seeing him safe and sound, greeted him warmly with a hug. Klaus, amazed, questioned whether David had truly defeated the giants. The soldiers corroborated the heroic deed, and just as the king was about to grant him the promised rewards, Klaus intervened. Prudently, he suggested to the king that he should hold back, mentioning that dangers still lurked in the north, such as the free-roaming unicorns. He proposed that David should also prove his bravery by capturing a unicorn, arguing that if he had managed to defeat the giants, he could surely handle a unicorn. Although the king was reluctant to send David on another mission so soon, he yielded to the safety of the kingdom and the insistence of his advisor. David, always ready to face challenges, accepted the new mission. The next day, armed with a strong rope provided by the king's servants to capture the unicorn, David received a gesture of affection from the princess, who threw a red handkerchief from her window, which he caught on the fly. With the rope and handkerchief in hand, he and 3 soldiers headed towards the area believed to be inhabited by the unicorn. After a lengthy journey, the soldiers indicated they had arrived at the place. David, determined, asked them to wait while he ventured alone into the forest in search of the mystical unicorn. At last, he spotted the imposing unicorn, whose horn radiated light from its forehead. Waving the red handkerchief to catch its interest, he tried to catch it. However, the unicorn proved to be unexpectedly agile and managed to escape, running swiftly through the dense forest. Far from giving up, David positioned himself next to a tree and, with a renewed tactic, waited for the ideal moment to allure the elusive creature again. Skillfully, he unfolded the red handkerchief and waited for the unicorn to approach at a gallop. Sensing its approach, he deftly slid to the other side of the tree. In a twist of fate, the unicorn charged with such impetus that its horn embedded itself in the tree, becoming trapped. Without delay, David used a rope to secure the unicorn, and, along with the soldiers, they returned victorious to the palace. Joy flooded the kingdom as they witnessed David's bravery, and the king welcomed him with a warm embrace. However, just as he was about to fulfill his promise to grant the hand of the princess, Klaus burst in again, alerting that a wild boar still posed a threat to the kingdom. Reluctantly, the king asked David to also face this new danger to ensure the total tranquility of the kingdom. David took on the mission, resolved, as always. That night, in a private meeting in the palace, David and Pavla exchanged confessions of love. Later, as David dozed in his room, reminiscing about his previous life as a tailor in dreams of fabrics and threads, Klaus, listening at the door, discovered his true occupation. The next day, as David and the soldiers ventured into the forest in search of the wild boar, Klaus revealed to the king David's true profession. The king, despite his initial surprise, valued David's bravery and decided to honor his word, disregarding the criticisms. Klaus, concerned about how the kingdom would be perceived, objected that a prince should not marry a tailor, emphasizing that David had concealed his true occupation. The king argued that David's feats deserved recognition, while Klaus suggested that they should discreetly expel him to keep the royal promise intact. Pavla, secretly listening, was alarmed by such machinations. Meanwhile, in the forest, a wild boar charged at David, who, in an instant reflex, ran towards a cabin, jumped through the window, and managed to dodge it, closing the door behind him and trapping the boar inside. Triumphant, he returned to the palace with the soldiers, being celebrated by the crowd that admired his daring. Upon demanding the king to fulfill his promise, the king began to make excuses. Sensing something amiss, that night David received a visit from Pavla, who confessed her love and unveiled the conspiracy. She knew he was a tailor and that Klaus had spread that news, but she didn't care. Moreover, she revealed Klaus's plans. Resolved to address the matter, that very night David pretended to sleep when Klaus and 3 soldiers entered his room with lethal intentions. With reckless calm and without turning around, David whispered that he had defeated 7 monsters and would not hesitate to face the 4 men present. Hearing this, Klaus and the soldiers, filled with terror, abandoned the kingdom. Seeing Klaus and the soldiers flee, David and Pavla were overwhelmed with happiness. The next day, the king promptly organized the wedding between Pavla and David, proclaiming him the new king. Thus, this enchanting fantasy saga was concluded,